So you should have just watched a video on the wood block print technique. That technique was used for several things, but one of the types of wood block prints that were created were ukiyo-es. Ukiyo-e literally means pictures of the floating world, and it's a name given to paintings and prints that primarily depict the transitory world of the licensed pleasure quarters, the theater, and the pleasure quarters of Edo, which is present-day Tokyo, Japan. Now, printed illustrations had been known in the Buddhist world since the Heian period. And in fact, the term ukiyo was a Buddhist term, and it was used to express the impermanence of human life. During the Edo period, which is from about 1615 to 1868, however, ukiyo came to refer to the sensual and pleasures of people, and the people who embraced them all the more for their ever-changing nature. The ukiyo-e evolved or came out of the tradition of hand-painted scrolls and screens of everyday life. The medium was changed to mass-produce wood block prints to meet the demands of the market. So this is a market-driven art form for sure. Because of this, the style often changed. The creation of wood block prints typically involved having a main artist. This artist would create the image. Then you would have a wood block carver, and then you have a printer. The person who would control the entire production and distribution, and the person who really profited from the whole thing the most, was the publisher. During the Edo period, the printed book became an independent art form. The earliest ukiyo-e prints date from about 1600. These early works were monochromatic, with the design laid out in bold black lines that we're looking at here. This is an example of an early print. Many of them were pretty erotic in nature. Their style imitated calligraphy, characters with this ink brushed line. In the 17th century, artists began to add color by hand, including red, blue, yellow, and orange. Erotic works and images of actors and beautiful women were very common subjects in the early ukiyo-es themes. They also had themes from Japanese myths, legends, literature, and history. These ukiyo-es appealed to the social class of merchants and craftsmen. Ukiyo-e prints by early masters working from about 1600 to 1740 were issued in limited numbers, so they're actually extremely rare today. So the one I'm showing you here is one of the rare examples from before 1740. In 1765, new technology made it possible to produce single-sheet prints in a whole range of colors. The first polychrome prints were calendars, and they were made on commission for a group of wealthy patrons in Edo. These wealthy patrons it was often customary for them to exchange beautifully designed calendars at the beginning of the year. The subgenres of these type of prints include things like portraits of famous courtesans, kabuki actors, and sumo wrestlers. They also include illustrations of romantic, historical dramas, or ghost stories. And something that was really popular are these explicit erotica images, specifically known as shunga. And if you're interested in this type of image, I do have a video posted where you can learn a little bit more about it. Kitagawa Itamoro produced a series of wood block prints in the late 18th century. Many of his series depicted women at home or in the licensed pleasure quarters. On the left, we have his image, which I think is in your book, and it is a woman holding a fan. On the right is another one of his images, and it's called the coquettish image, the coquettish type. It is a part of a series published in the early 1790s, and it depicts a woman who is just getting out of her bath. The woman is gorgeous and idealized to perfection, to express beauty and a sense of confidence. Her hair is perfectly styled, but her kimono is carelessly worn with a loosely tied sash around her. The background has been rubbed with mica to produce a silvery gray that highlights the warmth and softness of the tones of her skin. The artist uses bold lines and close-frame figures. His prints are often kind of spicy or sardonic and often psychologically critical. They were collected by famous artists that you may have heard of, Vincent van Gogh, that we talked about in this class, and some of the Art Nouveau artists as well, and other 19th century artists. His work directly inspired these artists. Now, even though these were not considered fine art by the upper class in Japan, they were collected by pretty much everyone. And here are just a couple examples of his work. Going back to this one, something like this with the patterning really reminds me of a Mary Cassatt. Another artist in this period that's also using woodblock prints is Katsushika Hokusai. He was born in 1760 in Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo, and he is known for his numerous cartoons, or mangas, and humorous sketches, as well as his woodblock prints. Now, when we hear the word manga today, we think of graphic novels, stories that are dramatically narrated through pictures, often in this comic book-like format. The literal meaning of the term manga in Japanese, however, is curious or whimsical drawings. And this was the 19th century understanding of the word when Hokusai's first volume of drawings, commonly known as the Hokusai manga, was published in 1814. They are basically model books of how to draw something, much like something used by artists in the West. Maybe you heard of Michelangelo doing something like this. I think we talked about that earlier in this class. Hokusai is best known for his landscapes. The landscape prints that he created really gave new life to this ancient genre. In Japan, there is a long tradition of celebrating famous sites with poetic associations, like a particular mountain or a river, and these are called meishoas. In Hokusai's work, he draws on previous Japanese traditions, and also some sources from Chinese illustration. He's also looking at Dutch artwork. He was interested in their use of linear perspective. And he often used their low horizon line, like we can see here in this Dutch print that we briefly talked about earlier in this class. He also catered to the art market. So he produced things that were going to be popular so he could make money. This is one of his most famous images. This is the Great Wave of Kanagawa, and it's from the 36 Views of Mount Fuji. The composition is a woodblock print, and it's said to have been inspired by many European artists, perhaps like the one that we just looked at. When we look at the composition, we mostly see the terrifying, awe-inspiring wave. That's sort of what we kind of focus on as our subject matter. We think, okay, this wave, and it's called the wave, so we think that this wave is the subject matter. But the subject matter is actually the mountain in the distance, here in the background. And it's Mount Fuji, which is the sacred mountain. Typically in art, and even in much of Hokusai's art, the mountain usually appears to be dominant and majestic, taking over the composition. But here the mountain is tiny. We barely notice it until we follow the future path of the wave. So here's the wave, and we're kind of following its future path of destruction. And then we're led to this tiny mountain. And so we realize that it kind of looks like that the wave will take on Mount Fuji next. Of course, Mount Fuji is safe in the distance. Departing from the more traditional forms, or rather further exploiting some of the sublime elements in nature that were depicted in tradition, Hokusai's work often depicts nature's menacing qualities. We do see humans in this composition. So here, and here, and here. We see these men in boats, but they're very generically produced, and we can see that they're trying to stay afloat in the midst of these kind of tsunami-like waves. Like we saw in earlier Chinese art, we saw that Fan Kuan's work from the Song Dynasty, people really play a very small part in nature's overall scheme. This also shows, it's kind of like a metaphor, or basically it's deliberately showing it to us, of the power of nature over the human world. Hokusai often uses blues in his compositions as a dominant color. We can definitely see that here. The blue used for this one was imported indigo from Prussia. Some scholars view his work as political and interpret the oarsmen as the focal point of this composition. They have to be more in unison to get around the sea. They have to work together in harmony with the sea. And so if you interpret it that way, it's an image of discipline and persistence in the face of violence and chaos. So some scholars see this as a metaphor for this particular period in Japanese history.